As I drop the camera down, I see Earth below me for the first time. And I'm looking at the Straits of Gibraltar and just entering into the Mediterranean Sea. And it just kind of blew me away.
Someone cares about you.
There's a reason why your heart is beating.
You still have a purpose.
Don't give up.
It's important to know that you're not alone.
You're not alone.
You're not alone. You are not alone.
Today's guest is retired Navy Captain Chris Cassidy, who has an extraordinary career that brought him from undersea exercises to combat operations in the mountains of Afghanistan and even walking in space while serving aboard the International Space Station. In 2021, he announced his retirement from NASA and the Navy to transition into his current role as President and CEO of the National Medal of Honor Museum, which is dedicated to sharing the stories and values of Medal of Honor recipients to inspire Americans to build upon their legacies. Chris, welcome to the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
Oh, thanks a lot. Glad to be here, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I've always wanted an opportunity to speak to an astronaut and get inside of your head a little bit. And with your remarkable career being the second Navy SEAL to become an astronaut, I wanted to know a little bit about your upbringing in the Northeast and the values that helped shape your desire to pursue a life of service.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, because we all, at every point in life, you're there with a certain path, and we all have our own paths, right? And like many of the listeners, mine took me through the United States military. And when I was a young guy growing up in the small town of Maine, York, Maine, I wasn't thinking about the military at all. I did all normal things. I loved sports. I played a sport every season, right? Baseball, football, basketball, baseball, and did a bunch of odd jobs in the summer, mowed lawns. And I think very early on, being a member of a sports team and just knowing that we didn't have a ton of money. We weren't like poor, but if I wanted to go to the movies, if I wanted to have gas in my car, I had to earn that money. So mowing lawns, worked in different restaurants. I have a huge appreciation for the people behind the scenes in a restaurant that have to lug the stuff off the truck and put it in the refrigerator and then get it. So all of that stuff kind of formed me as somebody who understands that you got to show up on time. You got to do your part. You got to be a nice teammate, whether that's on the field or at your work. And sort of those kind of core values were instilled in me and reinforced by my parents, but also kind of honed in just growing up in a small town and doing those things. And then when it came time to pay for college, I realized that you actually have to figure that part out. And that's what led me to explore a little bit ROTC, but I was more intrigued by service academies. I remember seeing some brochures with specifically the Naval Academy buildings and uniforms, and I thought, that's pretty cool. I could see myself there. We always watched the Army-Navy football game, so I pictured the pomp and circumstance of Army-Navy football with the students, and it's free to go there. You have to be in the military for a couple years after, 5 years after, but that was all good for me. I was excited to do that. So that's kind of what led me to military service. It wasn't like I had that all around me, military family members. I was really the first one. My dad was drafted in Vietnam, but did a couple of years there, and that was about it. So normal upbringing, and the path to the military was really motivated by helping for college.
Wow. We just recently visited the Naval Academy, actually, and got to learn a little bit about the paths. But how did you find your path to Navy SEAL throughout after the academy?
Yeah, so because you're obligated to serve in the military, in the Navy, after your commissioning, the Naval Academy, I assume West Point and Air Force the same thing, but Navy does a very good job of exposing you during your 4 years there to all the different community choices that you can have, like aviation, either in flying the plane or a naval flight officer, or ships and submarines, Marine Corps, SEAL teams, and a couple other variety of different things. And so it was in that process early on, I think my freshman year, when I saw my first SEAL person. He was on the staff there, motivating a very motivating person. That's why I'm sure he got those orders as to be a mentor. And I just kind of learned a little bit more. This was in the late 80s when, really before the internet and before SEAL teams were very widely known. Now everybody's heard of Navy SEALs, but back then, unless you grew up in San Diego or Norfolk, Virginia, you might have never heard of a Navy SEAL before. So, and that was the case with me. So I met him and got inspired and continued to do some workouts in the mornings, and then kind of kept throughout the years, kept doing the prerequisites to have that be an option for me my senior year when you actually select. And lo and behold, I was able to get one of the positions, one of the billets for the graduating seniors, and off I went to Buds.
Wow, that's incredible. Did your previous experience as a student athlete kind of aid in being able to make that transition into such a demanding career?
Well, just at the very beginning part, just Buds alone, yes, I knew I was a good runner, not a fast runner, I get crushed in the 40-yard dash, but I can keep that pace for a long time, at least back in my 20s. A little bit different now as a 50-year-old guy, but so I knew that running, and we didn't have a competitive swim team in my high school, but I always liked swimming, and I knew I wasn't intimidated by the water. I grew up near the ocean. So I wasn't nervous about could I do that physical stuff. But Buds is so mental. I didn't know how I would respond to those stresses and all of that. Turns out I did just fine. But the very nature of SEAL training, and probably all hard military training, is to break people down, not in a negative way, but get you to the point where you know you need help from the person to the left or to the right of you. And then together, as a class, as a unit, as a boat crew, as a swim pair, whatever element you want to look at the size, you get through those hard times together. And that's what now, with the benefit of maturity and hindsight, that's the whole purpose of SEAL training, is to get you to the point where you can count on others and others can count on you when you need it most. And I really liked it. It's hard training. Every day is a tough day, but just like on the space station, we used to joke around saying the weeks are long, the days are long, but the months are short. And it went by quickly. So finished SEAL training, and then off I went into the teams. So I guess the original question about sports helping, initially probably in training, but once you got through training and into the actual job, everybody was on par with each other.
Well, and it really seems like becoming a SEAL, from what I've heard, interviews I've listened to, and former SEALs that I've talked to, that team mentality really needs to be instilled, because if one person isn't going to be able to make it, the team isn't going to be able to complete the mission successfully. And so, from what I understand is that they're preparing you for challenges in the field as well as in real life. How do you feel like their preparation helped you set up for the rest of your career?
Oh, those skills are useful no matter what you're doing, whether you're carrying a backpack doing a SEAL mission underwater or in the boardroom. They're all skills that help you kind of grind through hard times as an individual, but then understand how you can pull together as a element, as a team, and get it done. There was a time on a spacewalk. I don't want to get ahead of us here on the podcast, but one of my spacewalks with an Italian guy, his spacesuit was malfunctioning, and I can go into more detail if you want. But the bottom line is we had to separate at a time when I felt in my core, we should be together. But the nature of the way the spacewalk was, we had to go different paths back, and that kind of harkened back to the very onset of Buds training. Is you go through it with a dive buddy. You're physically tied with a 6-foot rope when you're in the water, and that was still ingrained in me out on a spacewalk when I felt in my core we should be tied together at the hip right now because he needs me.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that story. What was going on that had your gut kind of going, maybe I need to be with him? and
Right.
and allowing that separation kind of against your training.
So the spacewalks are generally 6.5 to 7 hours long. They're full of activity, and all that is very choreographed and planned. And somebody is reading the script to you, and we generally have it memorized, but you're executing a checklist that together with the ground team you're operating through. And it was about 45 minutes into this planned 6.5 hour thing where Luca got an alarm on his spacesuit that indicated that he had high carbon dioxide, that we knew sensor was finicky to water, but all of us collectively said, it's okay. It's just the sensor, continue on. That's what the procedure says, and he's fine. And about 5 more minutes later, he actually felt water in his helmet. And then in the ensuing 5-10 minutes of discussion, that water grew to be about the size of a softball, or half of a softball, half of a grapefruit of water. And so collectively with the ground team and Luca and me, we said, all right, Luca, you probably should head back to the airlock. But the way we take paths to get places on the space station, we have these long dog leash tethers, like a rock climber has a tether to the rock face. So do spacewalkers. And you don't want those tethers to get tangled. So in order to prevent them from getting tangled, you take separate paths to get to where you're going to keep them physically separated. And in this particular case, those paths led over machinery that had to be shut down while we were out there, and a tricky routing, such that when the decision was, hey, Luca, you should go back. And he was fine at the time because he wasn't really moving and the water was still. But as soon as he started to go, that water whooshed around his face and got in his eyes and his ears and his nose. And he's on the backside of the space station, and I'm on the front side of the space station, cleaning up our area and meeting him back there. So at that very moment, even though we all agreed he was fine, he was no problem, he just had some water, it was not interfering with his mouth. But as soon as he started to move and he disappeared, we didn't know it, but that then made him blind, and he couldn't hear and he couldn't talk. But something in my gut at that very moment said, wait a minute, in this situation where it doesn't seem right, we should be together. But I knew all those things, like if I have to go with him, then one of our tethers has to remain out here. That shuts down all this equipment, which impacts the space station, and we won't be back out here in any short amount of time to fix it. So it turns out he miraculously made it back to the airlock, and we met there and we got in and everything was fine. And there's a lot more to the story, but the bottom line is the training that I had in SEAL teams, be together when that's the very reason you're a pair. It challenged my inner core to not go back with them, even though there was some technical reasons why it was impractical to go back.
That's got to be really tough to operate against that mentality, especially in space. All I'm picturing is you and nothing, kind of stepping into the void. Now, SEAL training did come in handy throughout your military career, and if Afghanistan, you even earned 2 Bronze Stars. How did those experiences shape your approach to leadership?
Yeah, one of the things when you're first starting out your military training, particularly as a young platoon leader, officer, or in charge of some number of guys, it's easy to get caught up in the tactics and like I have to shoot my gun very well. I have to run fast. I got to do a bunch of pull-ups. Those are all very important things. But a little bit into my first combat deployment in Afghanistan, it kind of dawned on me that my weapon was more my brain and our radio than it was my gun. And now every gun matters in a firefight, and you want to bring as much to the enemy as you can. But I sort of felt like if we were patrolling through some terrain and we all of a sudden get right in close contact with the enemy, maybe there was a decision an hour ago that we made that we could have made differently and ended up in better in a better advantageous spot on the hill or whatever. You fill in the blank. But that's when I realized, hey, as long as we as a unit are communicating and effectively getting a decision and executing it, I'm more value helping in that regard than any other way. And I don't know where I'm going with this, but it was kind of an eye-opening moment. Like, aha, this is why the Navy is paying me. It's to lead. It's to make good decisions. It's to balance risk versus mission success and know when to call back and ask for additional support or know when to be quiet and sneaky. All of those things play into it.
Well, I mean, part of completing a mission is knowing the tools that you have in your bag, and whether that tool is a team member, a fire team member, a buddy of yours. I mean, even in the civilian world, we have different tools to accomplish different missions, whether it's opening up a museum or, planning a vacation with the family.
Yeah, exactly. Knowing what you have, what resources you have available to you immediately, what resources you can ask for, and then how and when to apply those resources is the bottom line in pretty much anything that anybody does.
For your career, being a Navy SEAL is kind of the top tier for most operators and people that go enlisted. So how did your career end up intersecting to become an astronaut back in 2004?
Yeah, so I had just completed my about 4 years of my initial operating duty stations in the SEAL teams, and I was about to go to graduate school, and I was going to MIT. And I learned that Bill Shepard, who was the first Navy SEAL to become an astronaut, he had also gone to MIT. So I reached out to him and talked to him. And that was the first kind of inclination that I had that it's possible to apply to become an astronaut. I didn't know. I thought you had to be a pilot. And then I learned about Shep, and he wasn't a pilot. He was a SEAL. He went to the Naval Academy. And oh my gosh, he also went to MIT. So those things are kind of lining up similar for me. And if he was selected, maybe I could be selected as well. So in fact, I was leaving graduate school in Boston and driving to my next unit in San Diego. And in that drive, we swung through Houston, and I stopped and met him before he shipped off to his launch on the space station in 2000. Yeah, it was 2000. And he, in that conversation, he kind of inspired me to apply. He told me how to do it, where the website is, where you send the forms, who the head of selection is, all those details. And I applied. So I actually applied for the class of 2000. We select astronauts about every 4 years. And in that year, I wasn't selected. I didn't get an interview. And then 4 years later, in 2004, when I applied, I had combat experience in Afghanistan. I had already completed my graduate studies. I was just a much more well-rounded applicant. And lo and behold, they picked me. And it was through Shep's motivation that I applied.
With your career taking such drastic transitions from the academy to SEAL training, and then eventually becoming an astronaut, how did you manage to handle all those different transitions?
Yeah, transitions are challenging. They're fun. They're invigorating. I think it's good to be a new guy every now and then. It's easy to get complacent when you start doing something for a while and you feel like you're an expert. You can drop your guard down a little bit. In fact, I saw this is what I was most nervous about on combat deployments. You're there for 6 months. Initially, everybody's razor sharp and focused, and it's very difficult to keep that same edge sharp for 6 months straight. And every unit I read about it and watched it with my own eyes, is you kind of drop your complacency a little bit out. We know how to do this. We've seen this before. It's not a big deal. And that's when people get hurt. So those transitions in life are things you got to be ready for and be armed with. How am I going to handle this? And with any new transition, having mentors, having people help you if you're unsure of situations. Certainly when I got into the SEAL teams, that was the case. I remember Chief Slinger was my very first platoon chief, and he was such an awesome mentor and just kind of helped me get on my feet as a young SEAL officer. And then again, when I became an astronaut, Joe Tanner was an experienced astronaut, and he was such an awesome mentor and somebody that I, throughout my astronaut career, I would before every spacewalk, I would call Joe and say, "Hey, Joe, thank you." So those mentors are key, but also just knowing that it's okay to not know, and it's okay to ask questions, even if you're 20 years in the Navy and you're now on a space mission. It's your first one, and it's okay to ask for help and or ask questions and that sort of thing. Just leave your ego behind, and that's when the transitions are the most successful, where you go in with your ears open and your mouth shut, and soak it all in.
Right. Just listening to the people ahead of you is such a critical skill to learn, and actually gaining wisdom from them. For most people, they're never going to experience a trip to space. Even though it's becoming more accessible commercially, it's still out of reach. Could you talk about your experience of accumulating over 370 days in space, what those missions are like, the impact that it has on your physical, mental, and even familial health, leaving your wife and kids back home?
There's a lot to unpack there, but every mission is unique. My first one was a space shuttle mission, 2 weeks long. We went to the space station. My second and third missions were on a Russian Soyuz. We launched to the space station and stayed there for 6 months each time. So 3 missions, all to the same place, but because of duration and crew composition, they were all each unique in their own way. You asked about how it affects your body. When you're up there, we've got great exercise equipment, and if you did no exercise, your body would come back, your bones with serious bone density loss. We've learned over time that loaded weight-bearing exercises, predominantly big muscle groups, squats, deadlifts, that sort of thing, mitigates bone density loss almost entirely. So we dedicate an hour a day to weightlifting, and of course with your family, that's similar. I found to military deployments. 6 months is 6 months. It almost doesn't matter where you go. Life goes on for them. Stuff happens for them. Cars break, air conditioners break, kids fail tests at school, and all that's going to happen. And just communication is the name of the game. When I first got in the military, my first 6-month deployment, largely before the internet and the ability to make phone calls on the computer didn't exist. You had to wait in a long line for your 5 minutes to make a phone call, and that was an entirely different family experience than the way it is now, where you can talk all the time. Even on the space station, I could call on the phone every single day, and once a week we had a video conference to stay very in touch and tune with your family. So that part is all good. That's a big question. I don't know which direction you want me to go, but I could talk for an hour about any of it. So.
I can imagine. So, well, let's talk about the mental resilience. How many people are out there, and how are you able to maintain focus on the mission when you're up there with the same group of people for 6 months?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier about the days being long and the months short, and that's really true, and that's what I advise all kind of new space flyers, particularly for long duration missions. And because of that resilience factor, you can get a day can beat you down, right? And you're just in the grind of trying to get your job done, or maybe some particular task is not going as planned, and you're way past your allotted time, and you're dug in elbows deep into some component that you didn't think you'd be in, and there's parts everywhere, and you're hungry, and And there's no bad guys shooting at you, but in space, the bad guy is the environment, and you have to keep the spacecraft running well to protect you from the bad guy, which is the environment. And so there's some stress involved with that, and you just have to realize that every day, every minute, every event, all you can do is your best and mitigate mistakes. We very much covet sleep on the spacecraft. We in the space station. We don't mess around with it, because if you're fatigued, particularly in an accumulated way, you're very prone to make mistakes, and everything we do is based off our procedure. And when you're tired and your eyeballs are reading step 4 and you read over here to go execute what step 4 says, and you come back and you skip step 5 and now your eyeballs are on step 6 or 7, depending on what that is, it could be a big deal if you omitted something, or just because you're fatigued and tired and taking a mental checkout, you miss some actions that then impact the space station's safety, or in worst case, the crew safety of each other. So that mental resilience is a really key component, and sleep is a huge factor. Just days of work in a row. We have Monday through Friday our work days. Saturday's a half day. We do cleaning and housekeeping, or catch up on any jobs that didn't get completed during the week. And then Sunday's a day off. We look out the window, call friends and family, read books, watch movies, whatever the heck you want to do. And it's so important of a day because it's recharging you, keeping your ability to stay resilient throughout the 6 months. And occasionally, we're not able to take the luxury of having a Sunday off. A cargo ship will come, or a spacewalk has to happen that day, or something operational that dictates you just need to keep working. And when you start working 2 weeks into the third week without a day off, that's when I've noticed that people get a little antsy. The hangry factor ramps up. Mistakes tend to happen, and so as a crew, we self-police each other to make sure that, hey, you doing okay? Do we need to ask for more time for this particular thing, or that sort of thing? So that's where knowing each other, knowing your teammates, knowing your partners around you, whether it's your family or your colleagues at work, knowing your personalities, understanding little non-verbal clues that somebody might need some rest or might need some help. I'm done with my task a half hour early. Maybe I go over and help the other person because they didn't get a chance to go to lunch and they're dying of hunger, and I can relieve them and get it done. So that kind of thing all plays into the resilience to last 6 months.
It seems like it's can be quite overwhelming, and sleep is so important. It can really affect multiple areas of your health, whether it's just routine fatigue, as well as just overall like illnesses and physical health. Do you have any tips for anybody struggling with sleep? Because I imagine on the space station, you don't necessarily have night and day cycles.
We actually do. It's very interesting. Your circadian rhythm just kind of falls into place, even though you're going around the world every 90 minutes. So you have 45 minutes of sun, 45 minutes of dark. That equates to 16 sunrises and sunsets in a day. But largely, you're inside the walled building, so to speak, and there are windows, but those windows, whether the sun's out or not, doesn't really drive our circadian rhythm. You generally we put Greenwich Mean Time on our watches, London time, and so when you launch, you kind of use a couple hours to adjust to that new time zone, if you will, just like if you flew to Europe, and then you settle in and you wake up and you eat some breakfast, you work till you're hungry, you eat a little bit more, you work again until you're hungry, you eat some dinner, and then you wind down your evening and go to bed, and you kind of cycle that all over again, and you just kind of fall into the normal schedule that you have here. Looking out the window is something we do try to take advantage of, because it's the most unique aspect of being in space. In fact, if there was a day that went by where I didn't really get a chance to look out the window, at the very least, every night when I brushed my teeth, I would do it at the window and just kind of watch Earth go by. It's amazing to see it.
That's absolutely wild. When you mentioned 16 cycles of the sun and moon per day, that sounds absolutely surreal. And I know when you're in the military and on deployment, you find ways to have fun and exciting times and appreciate the environment. Is there any story or anything that kind of stood out to you that you looked out the window and you're just like, this kid from Maine sitting here in space, and this is really cool?
Yeah. In fact, on my very first launch on the shuttle, so launch day is a whole thing. I could talk about that. But once the engines cut off, my job on our shuttle crew was to take pictures of the external fuel tank. And the reason those are important is because the shuttle Columbia had its catastrophic accident because chunks of foam fell off of the tank on launch. And at high energy levels, that foam can poke through, cracked the thermal tiles of the shuttle. And then when they re-entered the atmosphere a couple weeks later, the plasma, high heat plasma, ripped the wing off and melted the wing off. So that's how they died. We learned through that if you can take pictures of the fuel tank and really be sure that there's no chunks of foam missing, then you're probably safe. So that was my job. As soon as the engines cut off, I had rehearsed it in my head, gloves off, helmet off, seat belt, camera, window, picture. And so I had this in my head. The engine's cut off. I do it just like I had planned. And I'm taking all these pictures. It's a giant telephoto lens looking at this just orange fuel tank out the lens. Halfway through the procedure, it says, change the camera lens to a wider view. And as I drop the camera down, now instead of looking through this drink straw, I see Earth below me for the first time. And I'm looking at the Straits of Gibraltar just entering into the Mediterranean Sea. And about a half hour earlier, we were at 0 knots at 0 altitude, basically on the launch pad in Florida. And now 30 minutes later, we're over the Straits of Gibraltar. And it was just unbelievable to me that that's where we were. And I was seeing Earth for the first time with my own eyes. And it just kind of blew me away. Another moment in time where I just really was marveled at Earth is it's not very often that you can sit and look out the window for an hour at a time because you're usually very busy up there. But one particular day, the Russians had a spacewalk, and for some technical reasons, myself and another guy had to be isolated in one compartment during the spacewalk and just wait there for the better part of 5-6 hours. And in that time, I had my kind of first and only opportunity where I had no other obligations, and I just sat out the window and watched a complete revolution of the Earth below us. 45 minutes of the nighttime and 45 minutes of the day without removing myself from the window. And realizing that I just circumvented the Earth in 90 minutes and I saw all these things, and you really can notice a lot of the details jump out at you when you're just sitting there and soaking it all in. So those two moments really stick out with me as times. There's lots of cool things have seen, but those are two really more special memories for looking out the window.
I have chills just thinking of that. Thank you for sharing that life-changing moment as you're witnessing just the Earth in all of its glory, and the fact that you get that you had an opportunity to do this job for as long as you did. And in 2021, you announced your retirement. What was that experience like and that decision like for you?
Well, as a military, when you get hired as an astronaut, if you're civilian, you become a civil servant and get paid that way. If you're in the military, you just transfer your duty station and you stay active duty, in my case, Navy. And as most of the listeners know, unless you're a flag officer or an E9 in your service, you have to retire at 30 years. So as a Navy captain, I knew at the 30-year mark, I must retire and make a decision if I wanted to remain at NASA, convert over to a civilian, or try something different. And so when I was on the space station in 2020 for those 6 months, I knew it was probably my last mission. I was at the 27-year mark, and by the time I got back and then did the retirement process, it would be the 28-year mark. So it was a logical time to retire if I was going to. And so while I was on the space station, I made the decision, okay, this is going to be my last hurrah as an active duty guy. I'm going to submit my military retirement paperwork and then see what life has in store for me then. And I was a little intrigued about staying at NASA as a civilian, but I also realized, hey, I'm 50. I was 50, 51. So all of that was part of the decision criteria, which was very logical and easy to arrive at a decision. But then there's the mental part of it, the emotional. I've had a government paycheck, a Navy paycheck since I was 18 years old, and it's sort of the fabric of who I am as a Navy guy. And people have warned me that, hey, just be ready for that emotional experience because it affects everybody differently. And sure enough, it got me. It didn't drive me to a grinding halt, but there was a moment when right before I retired, like a couple weeks, lying in bed going, oh, wow, like my military career is over and I'm entering into something new and unknown. I don't know what it is yet. Am I doing the right thing? That sort of stuff. And we all have those moments in any transition, but particularly military to civilian. You miss your guys, you miss your buddies, you miss your unit. I missed organized PT, all of those little things that make it. And I didn't, if I told my 17-year-old self this, you're going to miss service, that kid would have like, oh yeah, okay, whatever. But it was true. As an adult, I realized I really liked feeling like I was doing something good for the nation. I was serving the nation, wearing my uniform, whatever I was doing, it felt good. And how am I going to replace that? Fortunately for me, I'm working in a place now where I feel that that's still true, building a museum for Medal of Honor recipients. But I got lucky in finding this position.
How did you go about finding that? Because like you had mentioned, that loss of identity is real for a lot of people. I mean, it's the life that we know, and not too many careers allow you to retire in your 40s or early 50s. And then you have to figure out something else to do. So how did you go about finding the National Medal of Honor Museum and having an opportunity to continue service and building a new camaraderie?
I mean, quite honestly, when I was in that transition process, exploring what to do next, working for a nonprofit, it wasn't something that I thought of. It just, not that I was opposed to it, I just didn't register. It's very easy transition for particularly former astronauts to seek employment in a lot of these commercial space companies that are going, even the big names that you know, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. It's an easy transition, logical transition. We have a lot of connections and friends in those places and then also you add in SpaceX and Sierra Nevada and Blue Origin and all these other ones. There's plenty to do in that area, and kind of I was leaning that direction to be honest. But it was a friend of mine, my swim buddy in Buds, actually, Mike Hayes. He called me. He's on the board of directors of this foundation, and said, "Hey, I know you're retiring. Would you consider coming to work at the Medal of Honor Museum?" And at first, I was not really sure. I'm like, I don't know. I'm not a huge museum guy. I've never built anything. Never been part of a construction project. I certainly don't like asking people for money. So I'm not so sure that that's for me. But once he said, "No, just come on up to Dallas and meet the people, see what we're doing." And when I did that, and it just kind of hit me like, oh, this is a perfect fit for that void that we were just talking about, that service piece. And I can feel good about the mission. I don't mind asking people to support this because it's for a good cause. I value every dollar of donation support and because it's hard, and everybody's trying to do good for the most amount of people they can. So that part has been, I've enjoyed the fundraising more than I thought I would, because I feel like I'm offering another thing for people to give their philanthropic energy to, a good cause. And we as an organization will do right by every dollar and get this thing built. So anyways, long story short, it was a buddy that got me interested and connected, and the rest is history.
Mentorship seems to be such a key component with your life story, whether it's a friend pointing you in a direction, somebody that's been in those footsteps before, guiding you along the way. And I love that you've really listened to people along the way to take their suggestions. I really commend you for that, Chris. That's amazing that you have that humility to say, I'll listen and I'll investigate what you're suggesting. And it's led you to so many amazing things. And I hear you when you talk about asking for money can feel really icky or feel really wrong, except when it's for something important that you believe in. Would you mind sharing about the National Medal of Honor Museum and what's coming and why it's happening?
Happily, thanks for asking. There are a lot of military museums. There's many of them, and they're all well done. We're not trying to compete with those to learn about military history. What our aim is to inspire visitors through amazing stories of people, normal Americans that did something extraordinary when the nation needed them to do it, and they stepped up. So our museum will be a really biographical museum, and it's not going to be organized in chronological since the Civil War or by service. It's going to be organized just, there's some folks that came to the rescue of others. There's some that gave their life to the ultimate sacrifice. There's different thematic ways which we can show these. There's been 3,516 medals of honor awarded since Abraham Lincoln put the medal into existence in 1861. 65 of those are alive today. So in the museum, we'll be able to probably tell about 80 stories, and it's really not impossible. It's hard for somebody to soak in 80 stories in one visit. So they'll be distributed in some in-depth stories that we have a lot of artifacts for, others where you can read a little shorter version. And then we'll be able to rotate out those 3,500 stories over time. And you certainly will be ways you can read about every person digitally. But at the end of the day, the museum will be about people. Now, it's also a very iconic looking and symbolic building. It's a slab held up by 5 giant pillars, and each of those pillars represent a military branch of service. And the design concept the architect had, which I love, is it is all the members of the service for which the Medal of Honor recipients hold that medal. They if you talk to any one of them, they say, we're just the caretaker of this medal. It could have gone to Joe or Mike on either side of me, but I was the one that took the action or was awarded when it could have been anybody in the unit. So this nature of everybody supporting each other to where the museum is, and it's in a great location right next to AT&T Cowboy Stadium and the Texas Rangers baseball stadium. DFW Airport's 10 miles away. There's a Six Flags right in the backyard. So it's a super cool area, easy to get to from any part of the country, because it's a national museum, and it just happens to be in Texas, but it's a museum for the nation.
We're definitely looking forward to visiting on our next trip to Dallas area. And if anybody wants to get involved or even hear more about your story, how can they find out more about the National Medal of Honor Museum or you?
Yeah, certainly on our website, mohmuseum.org. You can learn all about us. You can read recipient citations and their stories. You can see renderings of what we'll look like. We're about halfway through construction. We started construction in March 25th, which is Medal of Honor Day. I didn't know that until I took this job. Every year, March 25th is our nation's Medal of Honor Day. So we broke ground a year ago in 2022 on Medal of Honor Day, and we will open in 2025, March 25th, Medal of Honor Day, that'll be our grand opening ceremony. So roughly halfway through that build cycle. If you drive by, you can see the building. But our website has all that information, mohmuseum.org. A little bit about me is on there, as well as the rest of our staff, we're about 25-person staff who are getting it done.
That's incredible work, and their stories need to continue to be told because they are extraordinary men and women that have paid incredible sacrifices for the betterment of this country. And I hope that people will continue to be inspired what they do as they're inspired to the veterans that live right there in their community as well. And with that, Chris, we know as veterans and supporters of our community that suicide is a critical issue that is being addressed by so many people trying to support the veteran community. And I would just love to ask you, is there any message that you would want to give to somebody that's currently going through a crisis or struggling?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. And because every one of us, me included, go through times where you're just kind of like, what am I doing? Do I have my act together? Life is hard right now? And the best advice I got in SEAL training, before SEAL training, was if you ever think about quitting, just make it to the next meal. So in other words, don't quit unless you're at the chow hall. But who the heck's going to quit at the chow hall? Because you got food, you're sitting there, instructors aren't yelling at you. And it was really brilliant advice. Just break things down into a 3-hour chunk because you can get to the next meal. You can go 3 more hours. And what I've learned now is that you could substitute that into any aspect of our life, because challenging times, if you think about the whole thing, it can be overwhelming. You don't think about Bud's graduation on day one. You think about the next meal. And I've grown to realize that applies in life too. And you can substitute the word meal for whatever increment in time you want. So if you're thinking about quitting, just make it to the next meal. Just make it to the next meeting. Just make it to bedtime, or reach out. And it's hard to reach out for me too. Like I've had times, when life, marriage, stress of moving, and you and your wife aren't on the same page on something. It just can get overwhelming. And whether that person that you reach out to is a counselor, or in my case, it's usually 1 or 2 guys that I've had friendships with since I was 18. We all were in Annapolis, plebe summer together, and there's friendships that are bonded there. That those are my best counselors, those guys, and they're not professional paid people, but I get so much value out of just bouncing my thoughts off of them, and they me. So reach out to those people in your life that you trust, make it to the next meal, and we'll all get through it together.
That's great advice. Chris, thank you so much for joining us here on the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
My pleasure.